This is my response to Group 2's Week 3 moderator video. And Group 2, I thought that when you looked at the nature of environmental injustices in agriculture, you brought up some of the points from the reading as far as the pesticides that are going into the food, the fact that we kind of aren't understanding as a society the different foods that we consume, and that looking at the environmental injustices in agriculture, that we are not being culturally sensitive. I thought that that was a really strong point that you guys brought up. When we look at the diets of society, we tend to kind of generalize everyone together, and we don't look at individual cultures. And I think that there's a difference between, as Leopold suggested, kind of seeing the world as a whole. I think that's important to see everybody as equals and to respect and appreciate everyone, but also still be aware of the cultural differences that exist. And embrace those differences. We're all a part of society and we all have something to offer. So when we see society as a whole, still acknowledging the fact that there are going to be differences amongst us, but appreciating those and welcoming them. And for instance, when we look at the diets of people, not necessarily looking at, okay, what is America as a whole consuming the most, but looking at those individual cultures so that we are being culturally sensitive. Your group talked about the fact that some demographics were being maybe discriminated against in terms of things like the African Americans. Staple foods were being affected at a greater rate. And I think that if we were being culturally sensitive and looking at these populations separately but still as a whole, so that we are treating everyone equally, and by doing that, acknowledging everyone, I think that when we fail to do that, we kind of aren't being equal because we're not recognizing the differences that exist, and then those minority groups are kind of being outnumbered by the majority, when really we're suggesting that if we're all equal, we should all be acknowledged. So looking at, instead of what does society as a whole consume, looking at what does each group consume, and then going from there. I thought that you had a very interesting idea as far as overcoming one of those environmental injustices in agriculture, which is the pesticides that are used on the plants. And you suggested, why don't we use broccoli as a pesticide? And I think that that's something that maybe people would laugh at and kind of think that it's a joke, but I think it's an interesting idea, because you talked about how the pests are attracted to it. So if we use broccoli, that's going to be a healthy means. And I think that we need to look at things like that that maybe don't come into our mind, that might seem strange, might seem kind of crazy, but what can we do that will be safe so that we can consume our foods without worrying about these pesticides? So I thought that that was a really interesting idea that you had. You also talked about how you needed to rely on your imagination to sustain, to obtain sustainability, and I think that we have to be willing to think outside of the box. If we just think in terms of, okay, what can we do with what we have? Well, we have a really bad situation. So we're going to need to learn to think outside of the box, be creative, find sustainable ways, look at things that haven't been looked at before. We can't just use existing ideas, or we're never going to truly become sustainable, because we're not going to be willing to grow and learn. And I think that our reading kind of talks about how we shouldn't go back to the way things used to be necessarily, because we are advancing as a society, and we should take advantage of those advances and utilize the advancements that we've made for our advantage. Taking advantage of technology and the knowledge that we have now as opposed to in the past, and using that knowledge and technology to become more sustainable, to have a better impact. So you talked about how the utopian vision kind of gives us an ideal of what we would want a sustainable world to look like. And I think that that goes back to, we have to be creative, we have to think big. We might not be able to jump headfirst into that and make all those big changes immediately, But if we aren't thinking big, then big changes are never going to happen. And as we learned from last week's reading, as far as being less bad isn't good, if we just keep making tiny steps and we aren't really trying to get anywhere big, then we're not really going to advance as far as we should. We're not going to become as sustainable as is kind of important that we do, because as long as we continue to kind of pollute the world as we're doing right now, consume at the rate that we're consuming, then we're slowly impacting future generations. And if we aren't willing to think big and kind of completely overcome our problems, then our small problems that keep existing are going to become big in the future. So I really liked your idea that we kind of have to embrace that utopian vision, because it's those big ideas that get us to strive to become sustainable. So I enjoyed Group 2's video, and I look forward to watching next week's.